What would you do if you discovered your own son had stolen the credit cards right out of your wallet for Barbara, a 68-year-old mother? The answer came in the most humiliating way possible. In the middle of a cheerful lunch, she proudly pulled out her card to pay, only to be frozen by a cold, quiet rejection while she sat there, swallowing her shame in front of her dearest friends. Somewhere else, her son was spending her money. When a mother's love is trampled by an act of theft, can she ever find it in her heart to forgive? Or is this the moment she must finally stand up and fight for herself? Follow along to discover what Barbara does next. And be sure to share your own thoughts in the comments below. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The Magnolia Leaf. My name is Barbara Hayes, and I am 68 years old. For 40 of those years, I taught history to teenagers, trying to make sense of the battles of the past. I never imagined the most brutal war I'd ever fight would begin over a chicken salad sandwich at a place called the Magnolia Leaf. The Magnolia Leaf is the kind of place that smells like sweet tea and quiet dignity. The sunlight comes through the big front windows in soft, dusty beams, and the clink of silverware on china is the loudest sound you'll hear. It was our place. Mine, Dottie's, and Maeve's. We've been friends since our sons were all scraped knees and grass stains. And now our sons are grown men with worries of their own. Our Tuesday lunches were a small sacrament, a quiet promise that some things, at least, don't change. That day was like any other. Dottie was complaining about her rose bushes. Maeve was showing us pictures of her new grandchild on her phone. And I was just content. There's a particular kind of peace that comes with age. I think a satisfaction in knowing you've paid your dues. That you can afford to sit in a sunbeam and order the pecan pie without a second thought. When the check came, I placed my hand on it before the waitress could even set it down. It's a habit. My habit. Now, Barb, you paid last time, Dottie said, reaching for her purse, and I'm paying this time, I said, my voice warm but firm. It was a small thing, paying for lunch, but it was my thing, a quiet declaration that I was fine. That after Arthur passed, after everything, I was still standing on my own 2 feet, independent. I slid my credit card from its slot in my wallet, the familiar, smooth rectangle of blue plastic, a symbol of a life carefully managed. The waitress, a young girl with kind eyes, returned a few moments later. She didn't meet my gaze. She placed the little black tray on the table and leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. Ma'am, she said. It's been declined. The words didn't seem to make sense. They hung in the air between us, thick and ugly. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. Oh, that can't be right, I said, trying to keep my voice light. I could feel Dottie's and Maeve's chatter stop beside me. The quiet in the restaurant suddenly felt very loud. Could you try it again? Please. She nodded and walked away. I watched her go, my heart starting to beat a little too fast. A frantic bird trapped in my ribs. I saw the manager say something to her. I saw a couple at the next table glance over. Their forks paused midair. She came back, her face full of pity. I'm sorry, she whispered again. It won't go through. Do you have another card? Another card. Yes. My debit card. The one linked directly to my checking account. The one I always kept tucked in a hidden flap for emergencies. My hands felt clumsy, my fingers like sausages as I fumbled through my wallet. I gave it to her, avoiding her eyes, avoiding everyone's eyes. When she returned the third time, the answer was in her face before she even spoke. I'm so sorry. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, heavy blanket that smothered me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could see was that young girl's pity. All I could feel were the eyes of strangers on me. And then, Dottie's hand was on the table, her own card placed neatly on the bill. It's okay, Barb, she said, her voice soft. She slid the tray toward herself and gave it to the waitress. Then she put her other hand on mine, a kind gesture, a gesture that felt like an anchor, drowning me. The drive home was silent. Dottie and Maeve tried to fill the quiet with small talk, but it was no use. The humiliation had a passenger seat, and it took up all the air in the car. I sat in my driveway for a long time after they dropped me off. The engine ticked as it cooled. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely unlock my phone. I found the number on the back of the debit card. The voice on the other end was professional. Calm. He asked for my name. My security information? Yes. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Both cards were declined. Your credit card is maxed out, and your checking account has insufficient funds. Maxed out, I repeated the words. My voice sounded thin, like a stranger's. That's not possible. The balance was, there was a large purchase made about an hour ago. Ma'am, he said, his voice flat. Factual. For $1,200. At a Best Buy on Route 41. $1,200. An electronics store. The world outside my windshield went blurry. My mind raced. Stumbling through the morning. Ryan had stopped by. Just for coffee, he'd said. He'd given me a hug at the door. He'd put his jacket on the chair by the entryway, right next to my purse. He knew I kept the debit card in the back flap. I'd told him once. Years ago, in case of an emergency. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I just sat there, in the suffocating silence of my car, staring at my own house. The house Arthur and I had built, the house where I had raised my son. It is a unique kind of pain. You see, to realize the hand you held as a child is the same one that reaches into your purse when you are not looking. A history of giving. The car was silent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the engine and the frantic thumping in my own chest. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were trembling. 68-year-old hands, spotted with age and experience. Hands that had held my son when he was a baby, guided him as he learned to walk, waved goodbye to him on his first day of school. I picked up my phone. It felt heavy, like a stone. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over his name. Ryan. Just for a second, I thought. Maybe it's a mistake, a system error, a glitch, anything but the truth that was sitting cold and hard in the pit of my stomach. But I had to know. I had to hear his voice. I pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. He answered on the third ring. His voice was rushed, impatient. Hey. Mom. What's up? I took a breath. The words came out quiet, almost a whisper. Ryan. I said, did you take my card? There was a pause. Not a guilty pause. A bothered pause. Like I had just interrupted something important. Oh. Yeah, he said. The words so casual they could have been about the weather. I just borrowed it. You need it right now. I'm kind of in the middle of something. He hung up before I could answer. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the passenger seat. I stared out the windshield, but I didn't see the parking lot or the people walking by. All I could hear was that one word, echoing in the silence of the car. Borrowed. You borrow a cup of sugar. You borrow a book. You don't borrow a person's dignity. You don't borrow their last line of defense against a world that can be unkind to a woman on her own. You take that, and he had taken it, and he didn't even notice. That's when the memories started. Not like a flood, but like a slow, toxic leak, seeping into the present. It started 10 years ago, right after Arthur died and the house became too quiet. Ryan had lost his job at some tech startup that went bust. He was behind on his rent, just for a couple of months. Mom, he'd said, just until I get back on my feet. A few months turned into 8. He never did get back on those particular feet. I just kept paying, because the thought of my son being evicted was more than I could bear. He was my son. Of course I would help. Then came Hannah, and with Hannah came new needs. A better apartment, better furniture. One afternoon, she called me. Her voice as sweet and thick as syrup. Mom, Barbara, she'd said, this old car of mine is a death trap. I'm just so worried about driving it. A week later, I was at the dealership, writing a check for a $5,000 down payment on a brand new, pristine white sedan. I remember watching them drive away in it, waving, feeling a little pang of something I couldn't name. I was still driving Arthur's 10-year-old Buick, and the vacations, the vacations. There was the trip to Hawaii for their anniversary, $5,000 from my savings account. I remember seeing the pictures on Facebook. Hannah in a bikini, Ryan with a sunburn, both of them holding cocktails with little umbrellas in them. They looked so happy. I'd asked, gently, if maybe I could come along next time. Oh, Mom, you'd be bored. Ryan had said, it's all beaches and hiking. Not your thing. My thing, apparently, was staying home at Christmas, eating a microwave dinner for one, while they went skiing in Colorado on money from my retirement fund. It wasn't just the big things. It was the constant, small drips that empty a well, the dinners at fancy restaurants I heard about later, the new clothes for Hannah's professional wardrobe, the concert tickets, the weekend getaways. It was a lifestyle built on the foundation of my life's savings, and as I sat there in my car, the shame from the diner still hot on my cheeks, I tried to remember one single time, just one, a time when they'd said, thank you. Mom, we couldn't have done it without you. The words never came, because it was never a gift. It was an expectation. It was my duty. I wasn't a mother who was helping her son. I was an account that had not yet been drained. I was a service that was supposed to be available 24 hours a day, and today, for the first time, the service was denied, and the customer was annoyed. The banging on the door. I spent the next hour on the phone, not with Ryan, with the bank. My voice, when I spoke to them, was a stranger's. It was calm, it was level, it did not tremble. I used words I had only ever read in crime novels. Unauthorized transaction, compromised account, freeze everything. The woman on the other end was efficient. Click-clack went her keyboard, sealing off the arteries of my financial life. When it was done, I hung up and sat in the quiet. The quiet didn't last long. At 4 o'clock, his car pulled into the driveway. The sound of the engine was familiar. A low rumble I had helped pay for. I didn't move from my chair in the living room. I just watched through the sheer curtains as he walked up the path. He had a bounce in his step, the kind of bounce a man has when he's just gotten away with something. The doorbell rang. A cheerful, two-note chime that suddenly sounded like a scream. I didn't answer. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap. My breathing was shallow. It rang again, longer this time. Then, a pause. Then, the knock. A polite, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Mom. His voice came through the door. Muffled. You in there. Silence. I could hear the floorboards creak on the porch as he shifted his weight. Mom. Come on. Open up. I know you're home. Your car's right there. The politeness was gone now. The knock became a pound. A hard, flat thud of a fist against oak. It was the door Arthur had installed. The one he'd spent a whole weekend sanding and staining until it was perfect. Each thud felt like a blow against my own ribs. Mom. What the hell is going on? My card just got declined at the gas station. All of them. His card. He said his card. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I just stood behind it, my hand resting on the cool brass of the doorknob. You need to leave. Ryan. I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried through the wood. There was a stunned silence on the other side. What, Mom? Open the door. We need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. I said. Yes. There is. You can't just cut me off. I have bills to pay. The car insurance is due tomorrow. His voice was rising, laced with panic and disbelief. The pounding started again. Faster. Angrier. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was an assault. You should have thought of that this morning. I said, my voice as cold and hard as the doorknob under my hand. What are you talking about? I just borrowed it. Borrowed. That word again. I was at lunch. Ryan. I said, the memory of the waitress's pity washing over me. With Dottie and Maeve, the pounding stopped. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Oh, he said. A small, weak sound. Mom, look. I can explain. No. I said. The word was simple, final. It was a word I hadn't said to him in 10 years. It felt strange in my mouth. It felt powerful. Mom, please. The desperation was raw now. You don't understand. I needed the money. You have to turn the cards back on. Just for a little while. No. And then, he broke. A different sound came through the door. A choked, ragged sob, and then a scream of pure frustration. "I lost my job," he yelled, his voice cracking, the words torn from him. "All right, is that what you want to hear? I lost my job 6 months ago." The confession hit the door and seeped through the wood, chilling me to the bone. 6 months. Hannah doesn't know. He sobbed, his forehead now pressed against the door. I could hear his muffled breathing. "Nobody knows. I've been juggling things, trying to figure it out. I didn't know what else to do." For a single, terrible moment, my hand tightened on the doorknob. Pity. It rose up in my throat like bile. My little boy, my son, lost and scared on the other side of a door. My every instinct screamed at me to open it, to pull him inside, to fix it, just like I always had. But then, the image of Dottie's kind, sad eyes flashed in my mind. The feeling of the whole restaurant staring, the heat of my own shame. I took my hand off the doorknob. "That is your problem to solve, Ryan," I said, my voice trembling but unbroken. "It's not my problem anymore." I heard a long, shuddering breath. Then, the sound of his footsteps, heavy and defeated, walking away from the door, down the path. The sound of his car door slamming shut. The sound of the engine driving away. He was gone. And in the crushing silence of my own home, the only sound was the beating of my own heart, torn between pity and a strange, new feeling of power. I have to ask you, listening to me now, what would you have done? Would you have opened that door? I truly want to know. Leave a comment on this video. Tell me your thoughts. Because on that day, I felt like the loneliest woman in the world, and I need to know I'm not alone in this. A different kind of debt. The morning after the banging on my door, the silence in my house felt different. It wasn't the lonely silence I was used to. It was a heavy, waiting silence. I knew I couldn't just sit in it. Anger is a fire. You see, it can warm you for a little while, but if you don't use its light to find a path, it will burn your house down. My first thought was a lawyer. That's what you see in the movies. But the thought of it made me feel tired. I wasn't ready for a war. Not yet. I just needed to understand what was happening to my own life. Then I remembered, months ago, at church, they'd had a guest speaker, a young woman who talked about planning for retirement. I'd taken her business card, a little piece of glossy paper, and tucked it into the side pocket of my purse. I hadn't thought I needed it then. Arthur had left me comfortable, but comfortable is a relative term. I found the card. Camila Davis, financial advisor. Her office was in a clean, modern building downtown that smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. Ms. Davis was a sharp, kind woman in her 40s with eyes that saw everything. I didn't have to tell her the whole story. I just told her I was worried about my spending habits and wanted to get a clearer picture of my financial health. She didn't pry. She just nodded and asked for my bank statements from the last 5 years. I had brought them with me in a neat manila folder. She laid them out on her large, polished desk. For the next hour, the only sounds were the quiet clicking of her calculator and the rustle of paper. I just sat there, watching her pen move across a legal pad, feeling like a patient waiting for a diagnosis. Finally, she put her pen down and looked at me, her expression gentle but firm. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice even. "Based on these statements, over the past 5 years, you have spent $92,450 on expenses that are not directly related to your own cost of living. $92,000. The number just hung there in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. A cold, hard, $92,000 fact. I saw it all flash before my eyes. The white sedan, the ski trips, the endless dinners. The more pressing issue," she continued, turning the legal pad around so I could see her calculations, "is the trajectory. If this level of spending continues, your retirement savings, the money your husband worked his whole life for, will be completely gone in 7 years. 7 years. I would be 75. I suddenly felt cold. I wasn't just losing money. I was losing my future. I was losing my independence. The one thing I had clung to so fiercely since Arthur was gone. I was trading my security for their comfort, and I hadn't even realized it. Ms. Davis gave me a plan. Simple steps. New accounts. Automatic transfers to a savings account that would be harder for me to access on impulse. She gave me back a sense of control. As I left her office, the city air felt a little easier to breathe. I had a path. It was a hard path, but it was mine. I was sitting in my kitchen that afternoon, holding a warm cup of tea. When my phone rang, it was Hannah. I almost didn't answer. I didn't think I could handle another confrontation, another demand. But something in me made me press the button. Her voice was nothing like I expected. It wasn't angry or entitled. It was small, broken. "Mom, Barbara," she whispered. There were tears in her voice. "Can we talk, please?" I was quiet. "I know what happened," she said, her words rushing out in a sob. "At the diner, and with Ryan at the door, I know what he did." "He told you he lost his job?" I asked, my voice flat. "Yes," she said. "He told me everything, but he didn't tell you the whole truth." I waited. "The money," she choked out. "The $1,200. It wasn't for a video game. Mom, Barbara, it wasn't for anything like that." She took a ragged breath. We've been trying to have a baby." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "A baby, for 3 years," she went on, her voice raw with a pain I had never heard from her before. "We've been going through IVF, in vitro fertilization. It's so expensive. Insurance doesn't cover it. We've used all our savings. We took out loans. This was our last chance, our last round. The money Ryan took, it was for the last payment on the medication. We had to pay it that day, or we would lose our spot." I sat there, gripping the phone, the world tilting on its axis. IVF, a grandchild, the one thing I had secretly prayed for in the quiet of my church pew every Sunday. "I know it was wrong," she cried, the shame pouring out of her. "It was so wrong, and I'm so sorry. Ryan was just so ashamed. Ashamed he couldn't provide, ashamed we couldn't. You know, the normal way. He didn't want to tell you we were failing." She paused, and her next words were a barely audible whisper. "I just wanted to give you a grandchild. Mom, Barbara. Ryan was just too proud to tell you the truth." I ended the call. I don't remember what I said. I just sat there in the fading afternoon light, the tea in my hands now cold. The clean lines and hard numbers from Ms. Davis's office blurred. This wasn't a simple matter of greed anymore. This wasn't about ski trips or fancy cars. This was about a different kind of debt. A debt of hope and failure and desperation. And I was right in the middle of it. The ghost in the armchair. I didn't sleep that night. Sleep felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. After Hannah's call, the neat little box of anger I had built around myself just fell apart. A grandchild. All this ugliness, this deceit, it was all wrapped around the hope for a child. A child I never knew they were fighting for. The thought was a splinter in my mind. And the more I tried to pull it out, the deeper it went. At 3 a.m, I gave up. The sheets on my bed felt like sandpaper. The silence in the house was too loud. I got up, the cold wood of the floor shocking my bare feet, and walked into the living room. I didn't turn on a light. The moonlight was enough. It cut a pale, silver rectangle across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My feet carried me, as they always did when my thoughts were too heavy, to Arthur's chair. It's an old leather armchair, worn, smooth, and shiny in all the places he used to touch. The headrest is darker from the oil in his hair. The right arm is slightly flattened from the weight of his arm over 30 years. It still smells faintly of him. A scent of old books and pipe tobacco that has somehow clung to the leather all this time. I sank into it. The worn leather sighed and enveloped me. A familiar, hollow comfort, and I sat, just sat, in the dark, with the ghost of my husband. My mind drifted back to the first year after he was gone. The silence. Oh, God. The silence. It wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the absence of his breathing in the bed next to me. The absence of his heavy footsteps on the stairs. The house felt cavernous, empty. My life, which had been a duet, was suddenly a solo. And I didn't know the words. I was so lonely, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache. A constant, low hum beneath my skin. And Ryan, he was all I had left of Arthur. I remembered it so clearly. Sitting there in the dark. It was about 6 months after the funeral. Ryan had called, his voice tight with worry. The transmission on his car had gone out. $2,000. He didn't ask. He just told me. Like a man sharing a terrible diagnosis, and I remember the feeling that washed over me. It wasn't sadness for his trouble. It wasn't even sympathy. It was relief. Relief that he needed me. Relief that there was a problem I could solve. I went to the bank the next day and wrote him a check. When I handed it to him, he hugged me so tight, told me I was a lifesaver, and for a few hours, the silence in the house went away. I felt useful, necessary. My purpose, which had been buried with Arthur, had a flicker of life again. I had always told myself that was love, a mother's love, unconditional, but sitting there, in the honest dark, with only the memory of Arthur for company, I finally saw the truth. It wasn't just love, it was fear. I hadn't been giving my son a safety net. I had been building him a cage, a comfortable cage, padded with my money. But a cage nonetheless. A cage to keep him close. Every check I wrote, every bill I paid, was another bar in that cage. It kept him dependent. It kept him coming back. It kept him needing his mother. The realization didn't come like a lightning bolt. It seeped in, cold and slow, like the midnight air through a cracked window. I hadn't been helping him. I had been using him, using his weakness, his lack of discipline, to feed my own terrifying need not to be alone. I had been buying his presence. I had been paying for his attention. All these years, I had painted myself as the victim, the martyr, the endless fountain of generosity. But I was the architect of this whole rotten structure. I leaned my head back against the worn leather, the place where Arthur's head used to rest, and I closed my eyes. A quiet conversation, held in the space between heartbeats. I did it. Arthur, I thought. The admission was a whisper in my soul. I did it. I took our boy, and I kept him from growing up. All because I was too scared to sit in this house by myself. The truth was a bitter, ugly thing. It offered no comfort, no absolution. And, for the first time in 3 days, I cried. Not for the money. Not for the humiliation at the restaurant. Not even for Ryan and his desperate, tangled life. I cried for me. For the woman who had been so afraid of her own silence. She had filled it with the wreckage of her son's future. I cried for the years I had spent watering a weed and calling it a flower. I cried for the love I had twisted into something else. Something transactional and broken. I cried until there were no tears left. And then, I just sat, a still, quiet woman in a dark room, finally acquainted with the ghost that had been haunting her all along. It was me. A contract for a different kind of love. The crying I did that night in Arthur's armchair, it was a different kind of crying. It wasn't for Ryan, or Hannah, or the $92,000. It was for me. For the woman who had been so afraid of an empty house that she had started filling it with the wrong things. When I finally stood up, as the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, the fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, cold clarity. I knew what I had to do. I didn't wait. I picked up the phone at 8 o'clock sharp and called Ryan. His voice was groggy, confused. Mom, Piedmont Park. I said. My voice was even calm. It didn't even sound like my own. The bench by the old oak tree. 3 o'clock this afternoon, both of you. There was a pause. I could hear him about to make an excuse. Be there, I said, and I hung up before he could answer. There was no room for negotiation. A teacher learns one thing: you set the terms, and you hold the line. I arrived at 2:45. I sat on the bench, my back straight, my purse placed neatly beside me. I watched families pushing strollers, young people throwing frisbees. The world was moving on, just as it always did. I felt strangely separate from it all, like I was watching a movie of someone else's life. They arrived at 3 o'clock on the dot. They walked across the grass towards me. Slow. Hesitant. Ryan's eyes were puffy. Hannah looked pale, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. They looked like children called to the principal's office. They stood in front of the bench, waiting. I didn't invite them to sit. I looked at Ryan. Then I looked at Hannah. I let the silence stretch out, letting them feel the weight of it. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low, but every word was clear and measured. I have spent the last few days, I began, thinking about how we got here, to this place, and I have realized something. I am not blameless. I saw a flicker of relief in Ryan's eyes. He thought this was going to be an apology. I was lonely after your father died. I continued, my gaze steady. And I used my money to keep you close. I used it to feel needed. It was my fear that turned our relationship into a transaction. I paid for your time, for your attention. And you learned to be very good at cashing the checks. Their faces fell. This was not the speech they were expecting. That transaction, I said, the words sharp and final, is over. The account is closed. I reached into my purse. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out 2 small, crisp business cards. I held them out. Ryan just stared at them. So I placed them in Hannah's trembling hand. The first card, I explained, is for Ms. Davis, a financial counselor. She specializes in debt. She can help you create a budget, consolidate your loans, and learn to live on what you earn. I paused. The second card is for a marriage counselor, Dr. Evans, because the lies you have been telling each other are far more dangerous than the ones you have been telling me. Hannah looked down at the cards in her hand as if they were burning her skin. Ryan's face was a mask of disbelief. This, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, but losing none of its steel, is the last thing my money will ever buy for you. Not cash, not cars, not vacations. Tools, the tools to build your own life. Whether you choose to use them, that is entirely up to you. I stood up. The meeting was over. I looked at my son, my only child. I saw the little boy who used to hold my hand, and the man who was lost, all in the same moment. I love you, Ryan, I said. And the words were true. They were truer now than they had been in years, because they were no longer tied to a price. But from this day forward, I am going to start loving myself more. And then I turned. I walked away without looking back. I could feel their eyes on me. 2 pairs of eyes, watching me as I walked across the green grass, under the wide open sky. A free woman. The reckoning in the rain. That night, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle summer shower. It was a biblical, southern downpour. Rain hammering against the roof, wind rattling the window panes. A proper storm. I was in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already clean, when I saw the headlights slice through the sheets of rain, sweeping across my driveway. I knew who it was. My heart didn't even have time to sink before the banging started. Not a knock, a frantic, desperate pounding that seemed to shake the whole house. I took a deep breath, walked to the front door, and opened it. There they stood, drenched. Ryan's hair was plastered to his forehead, his face pale and stark in the porch light. Hannah was beside him, shivering, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. They looked like 2 drowned children. For a moment, all I felt was the primal urge to pull them inside, to wrap them in warm towels. Then Ryan spoke, and the feeling vanished. What was that? He demanded, his voice raw, barely audible over the roar of the rain. He pushed past me into the entryway, dripping water all over the hardwood floor. Hannah followed, a silent, weeping shadow. What was that performance in the park? He repeated, turning on me. His eyes were wild. Who do you think you are, St. Barbara? Handing down judgments from on high. I just looked at him. The smell of wet wool and fury filled the small space. You did this to me, he shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction. You. For years, every time I tried to stand on my own, you were right there with a checkbook. Weren't you, pushing me back down, making sure I'd always have to come crawling back? The accusation was so twisted, so warped from the truth I had just forced myself to face, that all I could do was stare. He was using my own guilt as a weapon against me. Don't you put this on me, Ryan, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Oh, I am putting it on you, he raged. You loved it. You loved being the savior. You couldn't stand the thought of me not needing you. Not for 1 second, and then Hannah, who had been silent, let out a gut-wrenching sob. "Just stop it." "Ryan," she cried, her voice cracking, "stop blaming everyone else. Do you have any idea what this is like? Going to that clinic, month after month, feeling like a complete failure, and you couldn't even be honest. Too much of a coward to tell me you'd lost your job. A coward, Ryan whirled on her. I was trying to protect you from this, from all of this. Protect me. You lied to me. It was chaos. A storm inside to match the one outside. Their accusations and recriminations flew through the air. Ugly and sharp. They were tearing each other apart. Right there in my foyer. And all of their pain, all of their fear and shame, it all came circling back to one place. Me. And your mother. Always dangling the money. If we just had a little more, we wouldn't be in this mess. She was never going to let us be free. Something inside me snapped. Enough. My voice wasn't a shout. It was a crack of a whip. It cut through their noise and silenced them both. They turned to look at me. Their faces shocked. "You want to talk about cages," I said. Stepping toward them, the tremor was gone from my voice. All that was left was a cold, hard clarity. "I may have given you the bricks. Ryan, my fear, my loneliness, yes, I will own that. I gave you the bricks, but you are the one who built the prison. Wall by wall. You chose to lie. You chose to take what wasn't yours. You chose to live a life you couldn't afford and then blame the whole world when it came crashing down." I turned to Hannah, her face streaked with tears. "And you wanted a child so badly you were willing to let your husband steal from his own mother to get it. You stood by and let it happen." The truth hung in the air between us. Raw, brutal, undeniable. Ryan's face crumpled. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind something hollow and broken. I just wanted to be the man he would have been proud of," he whispered, looking past me, at the empty armchair in the living room. At his father, Hannah just wrapped her arms around herself and sobbed. A deep, exhausted sound of utter defeat. We stood there for a long time. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and Hannah's weeping. The fight was over. All the anger had been spent, leaving nothing but the wreckage. Finally, Ryan looked at Hannah. He didn't touch her, but he took a small step toward her. "Come on," he said, his voice thick. "Let's go." They walked out the door without another word. They didn't close it behind them. They just walked back into the storm and disappeared into the night. I stood there, watching the rain blow into my house, soaking the floor where they had stood. And just like that, it was over. The storm outside and the storm inside had finally broken. I reached out and slowly, quietly, closed the door. I leaned my back against it and slid down to the floor, feeling nothing but the hollow echo of their words. If you are still listening to my story, please help me by commenting the home below, just so I know there are friends walking this journey with me. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part, because in that moment, I had never felt more alone. Learning the sound of my own name. After the storm, there was silence. For the first few days, it was a heavy, suffocating thing. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat, a frantic bird beating against my ribs. But it was never him. It was a telemarketer, or my sister calling from Florida. I would catch myself staring at his name in my contacts list, my thumb hovering over the call button, the urge to check on him, to make sure he was okay, was a physical ache. Like a phantom limb, it was an old habit, a deep groove carved into the landscape of my motherhood. And it was the hardest thing in the world not to fall back into it. But I didn't call. Slowly, day by day, the silence began to change. It stopped being an absence of his voice and started to become the presence of my own quiet. The house, which had felt so empty for so long, began to feel spacious. It was a space waiting to be filled, not with noise, but with me. One rainy afternoon, I climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, a place I hadn't been in years. It smelled of cedar and dust and forgotten time. In a corner, under a white sheet, was a box of Arthur's old things. I opened it. Inside, Nestled among sweaters that still faintly smelled of him was his old record player and a crate of his beloved jazz albums. John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald. I brought the record player downstairs, cleaned the dust off the needle, and put on a record. The first notes of a saxophone, low and soulful, filled the living room. It was the first time there had been music in that house. Real music. Since Arthur died. I sat in his armchair, closed my eyes, and just listened. The music didn't fill the silence. It danced with it. The next morning, I did something else I hadn't done in a long time. I called Dottie. Then I called Maeve. I didn't tell them everything. Not the ugly parts. I just said, "I'm sorry I've been so distant. I'd love to have lunch." My treat. We went back to the Magnolia Leaf. When the bill came, I placed my new debit card on the tray. It felt solid. Real. Dottie reached for her purse, but I just smiled and shook my head. "No." I said, "This one's on me." It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming the memory of the place. We split the bill 3 ways, laughing like we used to. On the community bulletin board at the library, I saw a flyer, Introduction to Pottery, Tuesdays at 10 a.m. I'd always wanted to try. I had always told myself I didn't have the time or the talent, but whose time had I been living on? The next Tuesday, I was there. My hands, which had trembled with rage and shame just weeks before, were now covered in cool, wet clay. The instructor, a young woman with kind eyes, showed us how to center the clay on the wheel. "You have to be firm, but gentle," she said. "You guide it. You don't force it." My first few attempts were wobbly, misshapen messes. I laughed. It didn't matter. It was the feeling of it. The feeling of making something out of nothing, something that was mine. By the end of the class, I had made a small, lopsided bowl. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I started taking walks in the evening, not to get anywhere, just to walk. I noticed things I hadn't seen in years. The way the sunset painted the undersides of the clouds, the scent of jasmine from my neighbor's fence. I was living inside my own life again, not just observing it from a distance. One day at the pottery class, the instructor called out across the room, "Barbara," she said, "can you pass me that sponge?" And I turned, and I answered. And it was the strangest feeling. For so long, I had been mom. I was an identity attached to someone else. When people said my name, I heard it in the context of my son, Barbara, Ryan's mother. But when this young woman said my name, it was just mine. Barbara. A person. A woman with clay on her hands and jazz music waiting for her at home. I was learning the sound of my own name, and it was a beautiful sound. The first payment. 3 months passed. A season turned. The ferocious summer heat of Georgia finally broke, giving way to the cool, crisp mornings of autumn. The world outside my window began to change. And slowly, quietly, so did the world within me. The silence that followed the storm in my entryway was a presence of its own. In the first few weeks, it was a heavy, aching void. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every hum of the refrigerator in the stillness of the afternoon, seemed to amplify the absence of a phone call, of a car pulling into the driveway. The loneliness I had built my life around avoiding had finally moved in. It sat with me at the dinner table, an unwelcome guest, and it watched television with me in Arthur's chair in the evenings. But loneliness, I discovered, is a guest that can't stay forever if you don't set a place for it. You have to stop waiting for it to leave and, instead, start filling the house with your own life. I began in the garden. Arthur's prize-winning roses had become tangled with insidious vines, their beautiful heads drooping in neglect, a perfect metaphor for everything else. I spent a whole week out there, on my hands and knees in the dirt, my old joints screaming in protest. I pulled up the bitter roots of weeds until my fingers were raw and my back ached. With every weed I pulled, it felt like I was clearing away a piece of the resentment that had taken root in my own heart. I talked to the roses as I worked, snipping away the dead blooms. I talked to Arthur, telling him how sorry I was for letting things get so overgrown. And, for the first time, I talked to myself with a kindness I hadn't felt in years. I called Dottie and Maeve, not with excuses, but with a simple, honest admission. I'm sorry I've been so distant. I told them I was lost for a while. They didn't press for details or offer pity. True friends rarely do. They just said, "We're here. How about lunch on Tuesday?" And just like that, the easy, comfortable rhythm of our friendship picked up right where it had left off. This time, we split the check, and it felt right. On a whim, I signed up for that pottery class at the community center, the one I'd been seeing flyers for years. My first few attempts on the wheel were disastrous, wobbly, lopsided things that collapsed into muddy heaps. But I kept going back. There was something profoundly grounding about the feel of the cool, wet clay spinning beneath my hands. Something honest about creating a thing from scratch, using only your own strength, your own focus, your own skill. I was making something that was entirely, imperfectly mine. The sharp edges of my anger and my grief began to soften. They didn't disappear. I don't think they ever will. Entirely. They have become a part of the landscape of my life. Like old, smooth stones in a riverbed you learn to navigate around, instead of the jagged rocks that once threatened to tear you apart. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. The air was clean and sharp, and the leaves on the maple tree in my front yard were a riot of red and gold. I'd just come back from my walk, feeling the pleasant ache in my legs, and I went to the mailbox, same as any other day. Among the usual junk mail and a bill for the water, there was a plain white envelope, a standard business-size one. My name and address were written on the front in a messy, rushed script, a familiar script. There was no return address. My heart did a strange little flutter against my ribs. It wasn't just one feeling, but a tangled knot of them: fear, hope, dread, and a fragile, tentative curiosity. I carried it inside, the thin paper cool against my fingers, and set it on the kitchen counter. I stared at it as if it were a dormant snake. For a full minute, I considered just throwing it in the trash. Unopened, the new, quiet peace I had so carefully cultivated felt like a delicate bubble, and I was terrified that whatever was inside that envelope would be the pinprick that burst it. But you cannot live your life afraid of envelope. Taking a slow breath, I picked it up. My fingers felt a little stiff, a little clumsy, as I tore open the seal. It wasn't a long, rambling letter full of the excuses or accusations I had braced myself for. It wasn't a cry for help or another demand. It was just two small, unassuming pieces of paper. The first was a check, a personal check from a credit union I didn't recognize. It was made out to me, Barbara Hayes, for the amount of $50. $50. Not a grand, impossible sum, not a meaningless pittance, a specific, deliberate amount. The second piece of paper was smaller, torn from a spiral notebook, the kind a student might use. There were only a few sentences, written in Ryan's familiar, untidy scrawl. "This isn't a loan repayment. It's for the lunch you never got to finish. I started a new job. It's not glamorous. Hannah is taking extra hours at the library. We saw the counselors. It's hard, that's all." I read the words again, and again. My eyes traced the clumsy loops of his letters, the way his N's were crossed just a little too low. I could see him sitting at a cheap desk somewhere, wrestling with what to say, what not to say. The stark honesty of it resonated more deeply than any flowery apology ever could. It's hard. Two simple words that acknowledged the mountain they had to climb. Without asking me for a rope, this wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation. This wasn't a promise that everything was fixed and forgotten. It was something smaller. And because of that, infinitely more real. It was a single brick, laid carefully on a new, uncertain foundation. It was an acknowledgement. It was the beginning of an amends. I stood there in my quiet kitchen, the autumn sunlight warming the floor, and I held those two pieces of paper in my hand, and I felt a quiet, profound shift happen inside me. The last stubborn embers of my bitterness, the ones I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to, seemed to cool and fade, leaving behind not forgiveness. Exactly. Not yet. That was a bigger word. For a later day. What I felt was something close to it. Understanding. I didn't take the check to the bank. It didn't feel like money to be spent. It felt like something else. A receipt. perhaps. For a lesson learned. I walked into the living room and tucked it inside a book of poetry that sits on my coffee table. Sometimes, when the light from the window is just right, I can see the pale blue edge of it sticking out from between the pages. A small, quiet reminder, not of a debt being paid, but of a life, perhaps, finally beginning to be earned. The Unwritten Chapter. It's been a year, or maybe a little more. Time moves differently now. It doesn't rush past me in a blur of anxiety and obligation. It unfolds. Like the petals of the peonies I planted last fall. Today is a Saturday, and the only sound in my garden is the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a hammer against wood. It's a good sound, a solid sound, the sound of something being mended, not just patched up. Ryan is here. He's fixing the loose slat in the back fence, the one that's been leaning a little more to the left with every storm. He's not here because I nagged him about it, or because I slipped him a $50 bill and called it a gift. He's here because he drove by last week on his way home from his new job, a steady, less glamorous job that pays the bills, and he saw it. He'd called me later that evening, saw the fence, Mom, and star. He'd said, "I can fix that for you. I've got some time Saturday." He's wearing an old t-shirt from a college I don't think he even went to, and there's a smear of dirt across his cheek. His brow is furrowed in concentration, the same way it used to be when he was a little boy, meticulously piecing together a Lego set on the living room floor. He isn't complaining about the sun or the sweat trickling down his temples. He's just working, building something. We don't talk much while he works. We don't need to. The silence between us now is a comfortable one. A freshly tilled garden waiting for new things to grow. It's not the heavy, suffocating silence of things unsaid, but the peaceful quiet of a shared understanding. It's the silence of two people who have walked through a fire, who have seen the worst in each other, and have come out on the other side with nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. After a while, the back door of the house slides open with a gentle whoosh. Hannah comes out, carefully balancing a tray. On it are 3 tall glasses of lemonade, sweating in the afternoon heat, the condensation tracing little rivers down the sides. She smiles at me, a real smile, one that reaches her eyes. It's not the brittle, practiced smile of a woman trying to keep up appearances. She's working extra hours at the library now, helping to organize a children's reading program. She looks tired, yes, but it's a good kind of tired. The deep, satisfying exhaustion that comes from earning your own peace, one page at a time. "Thought you two might be thirsty," she says, her voice soft. She sets the tray down on the small, weathered patio table. We sit for a few minutes, the 3 of us, the ice clinking in our glasses like tiny bells. The conversation is easy, unforced. We talk about small things, the ordinary fabric of life. Hannah tells a funny story about a little boy at the library who was convinced a pigeon was trying to check out a book. Ryan talks about a new documentary he watched. I tell them about my lopsided pottery bowl, the first one I ever made, which now sits proudly on my porch railing, holding a small, cheerful red geranium. It's a little clumsy. This new way of being together, a little out of practice, but it's real. We are not performing for an invisible audience anymore. We are not the family from the glossy, curated photos of Hawaiian vacations. We are just this, 3 people in a quiet backyard on a sunny afternoon, drinking lemonade that's a little too sweet. As Ryan gets up to go back to the fence, he pauses. He picks up a nail from the box, studying it as if it holds some great secret. He doesn't look at me when he speaks. We put a pause on the IVF thing, he says, his voice low and steady. Dr. Evans, the counselor, she said something that stuck with us. She said, "You can't build a nursery on a cracked foundation." He finally looks up, first at Hannah, then at me. Figured we ought to learn how to build a foundation before we try to build a family. I just nod, a deep, slow nod of understanding. I don't say, "I told you so." I don't say, "That's wise." I don't say anything, because his words are not for me to comment on. They are for him. He has said it all. He understands. They leave an hour later, as the sun begins to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. Ryan hugs me goodbye. It's not a quick, Dutiful hug. The kind you give an aunt at a family gathering. It's a real one. He holds on for a second longer than he used to. His arms strong around me. I'll finish the rest of the fence next weekend. He says. It's not a vague promise. It's a plan, a commitment. After their car pulls away, the sound of its engine fading down the street. I stay in the garden. The air is warm and smells of freshly cut grass and rich earth. I walk over to my flower bed, my fingers sinking into the cool, dark soil. I gently pull a stubborn weed that has wrapped itself around the base of a rose bush. I look at my hands, stained with soil, streaks of dirt under my fingernails. For so many years, I thought my job as a mother was to pave a smooth, easy road for my son. I thought love meant pulling up every weed before it could sprout, removing every sharp stone from his path so he would never stumble, never feel pain. I learned the hard way, the only way, that a parent's true job isn't to clear the path. It's to give their children a sturdy pair of shoes, to teach them how to tie the laces themselves, and to have faith that they can walk their own journey. Bumps and all. And Ryan, I think he finally learned that adulthood isn't an age you reach on a calendar, or a salary you earn. It is a choice you have to make, every single day. The choice to carry your own weight, the choice to own your own failures, to look them in the eye without flinching, the choice to find dignity not in what you are given, but in what you build with your own two hands. However humble it may be, he is building his life now. It isn't a mansion built on a foundation of my fear. It's a small, sturdy house, and he is laying every brick himself. We live in a world that screams at us to have more, to be more, to show more on a screen. A world where the illusion of success is often bought on credit, both financial and emotional, leaving us all deeply in a debt of our own making. Perhaps the most radical act of love we can offer to ourselves and to our children is to teach them the quiet, profound peace of having and being Golette. Simply enough. The garden is quiet now, the fence is mended, and for the first time in a very long time, I am looking forward to tomorrow. Barbara's story is finished, but I imagine the feeling of it still sits with you, as it does with me. So I have to ask you, directly, was her final act one of profound cruelty? Or was it the greatest act of love she could possibly offer her son? Would you have had the strength to mend that fence? Or would you have felt the need to tear it down completely? I genuinely need to hear your voice on this. Drop your truth in the comments. I'm not just reading them. I'm learning from them. Every perspective adds another layer to the story. If this journey sparks something in you, let a like be the signal. Share it with the one person you know you can have these difficult, important conversations with. Subscribing to Dipucator Stories means you're ready for more stories that don't offer easy answers, but instead, honor the complexity of the human heart. Take care of your own stories. And I'll be back soon with another one worth listening to.